Now, what this essentially is, for all of those of you who don't frequent the internet too often, essentially, what's been happening in recent day is that a lot of people have been doing their own little things called these tier lists. And what the tier list is essentially you just sort of rank things based off of the grade you would give them. It's essentially like being a teacher, in that sense. This is our little tier bracket here. It's A, B, C, D, F, and S. I've never understood the S rank. I'm not sure what S is supposed to stand for. I guess special, I guess silver, I guess Sonic, because I know that the Sonic games have S ranks in them all the time, and they're meant to stand for Sonic, but I've never understood what an S rank is. So I kind of classify S rank as beyond being graded, or beyond being compared. And what we're going to be doing is a topic which I've always enjoyed. This is essentially, I took the idea of this video, I'm not going to lie, I'll be honest with my influences. I took the main bulk of the idea of this video from Anthony Fantano. He did a video recently on his personal channel, which was his tier list ranking of White Stripes albums. And I watched it and I went, that's not a half bad idea. And so now I'm going to be doing this on my personal favorite Beatles albums. Not my personal favorite, yeah. The Beatles albums. I've got my little vinyl copies here, which you have seen in the SpongeBob Battle for Bikini Bottom video, where I showed them off. It's a nice little box set here of all their vinyl. And essentially what we're going to be doing in this video is we're going to be going through the ranks of all their studio albums, excluding past masters. If you can see that, we're going to be excluding past masters because it is a singles collection. And the thing with the Beatles is that their singles are so good and so supremely important in the history of pop music that it almost isn't fair. Because on this one compilation record, you've got From Me to You, She Loves You, I Want to Hold Your Hand, I Feel Fine, Day Tripper, We Can Work It Out, Paperback Writer, Lady Madonna, Hey Jude, Get Back, The Ballad of John and Yoko, Let It Be. It's pretty much their singles. Everything that didn't make it onto their full-length albums. So, including that in the ranking doesn't really work, doesn't really match up. It just sort of ends up being sort of like it's too OP. It's too overpowered. It's too packed with goodies to really be within fair ranking. So we're not going to be ranking past masters with all the other records. We're just going to be going through their main discography, the main 13 albums, which is the 12 English studio albums plus the American Magical Mystery Tour record. And we're just going to go through and do our little tier ranking, and we'll see what we have by the end of it. So, with that said, let's kick things off with record number 1, Please Please Me. Or, as it says on this album cover, Please Please Me with Love Me Do and 12 other songs. Because this screams early 60s album cover, It does. It's one of those records that just is like, it's built around the singles, and one of the rare instances of a Beatles album being built around the singles. There's only like 2 other instances of this really happening in their discography, and both times it's because of practically all times it's because of an American influence on record production. In America, and that's another thing too, we're going to be excluding the American albums or the Japanese records or any of the different like special region territory albums, even though in some cases I think the American versions of their albums surpass even the English versions. But we're not going to be talking about those. We're just talking about the main English records. Now, Please Please Me is essentially a burst of energy from a band who are just enjoying their time in the spotlight because they're getting it for the first time ever. And the classic story is they recorded not the entire album. I think people think they recorded the whole album in a day, and that's not true. They recorded it over the course of like 3 days, because you have Love Me Do and P.S. I Love You, which was their debut single, which was recorded in like September of 1962, and you also have Please Please Me and Ask Me Why, which was their second single, and that was recorded in like December or November of 1962. The rest of it all got recorded in the same day in like March of 1963, but they have the 2 opening singles tacked on here, which is the title track and Love Me Do. And obviously, like, Love Me Do is simple but effective as a song, and as a debut single, it's fine enough. Please Please Me has got that kind of Roy Orbison influence in it, even if it's not immediately apparent because of how fast they took it. The highlights are, they're already Lennon and McCartney, or on this album, they're credited as McCartney-Lennon. Already they're like really kicking it into high gear. You have that classic opening of I Saw Her Standing There, and Paul McCartney's 1, 2, 3, 4, just like kicking the whole band discography into high gear. It's really energy is what I consider this album. It's the same sort of thing with like Elvis's first RCA record. When I think of Please Please Me, I think of the Beatles and their boundless energy and excitement at being in the recording studio for like the first times they've been doing that. And obviously it culminates at the end with their rendition of Twist and Shout. The original was by the Isley Brothers and it's a classic, but then you have the closing rendition of it here with John Lennon having no voice left, pretty much having sung through the entire album over the course of a day. He just gave it his all and just screamed it, and that really delivered, one of the great all-time rock performances. So, I mean, it's like an energy burst, and that's great. But then it's dated very poorly, I think. More so than any other Beatles album, I think Please Please Me has dated possibly the worst, because not all the originals are stellar. You've got Misery, which is very Broadway. You've got Ask Me Why, very Broadway. Do You Want to Know a Secret? Very Disney. Like, it clearly ripping off some elements from, like, that Snow White song, where she's at the wishing well. I think John Lennon even, like, mentioned that. The production from George Martin is not one of his best ones. In stereo, this record's ridiculously difficult to listen to because you've got that classic, like, vocals in one speaker and instruments in another. But he also did this thing. I don't know why he did it, but there are some tracks where the backing vocals are so drenched in reverb, they sound like they're coming from a sewage drain, Like they're in the catacombs of the depths of Liverpool, and it causes some tracks to really not sound very fantastic. And you've also got, half of it is covers, and the covers are very strong even when you get like weaker tracks like Taste of Honey. So it's a mixed bag, all things considered, I would say. It's one of those records where you're like sort of in it for the energy and for the excitement that the Beatles clearly have of being there in the recording studio, but it's not their grandest work. So I would say that probably because of it being a mixed bag, it falls. Let's give it C. Let's put it in C tier. I think it's okay. Maybe I'll put it up to a B later, but at the moment, I think having it at C tier is exactly where it belongs, and that's very fine and very right, and I think that that's not incorrect. So, there is that. Right. Now then, moving on from Please Please Me, we have album number 2, with the... Sorry for knocking the mic. With the Beatles. In this classic album cover. Already they're getting more artsy in their appearance and in their sort of design choices. This is the first album that they build off, that they pretty much make their own standalone record. They don't try to build it off the singles like they did on Please Please Me. So you don't have... So the hits that are on this are very much album hits. So All My Loving, which got big because of its performance on the Ed Sullivan Show, It Won't Be Long, George Harrison's first song, Don't Bother Me, their covers of Till There Was You from The Music Man and Please Mr. Postman and Chuck Berry's Roll Over Beethoven, the Ringo spotlight of I Want to Be Your Man, the kind of deep cut of Not a Second Time. It's got... it's very much a fan album, I would say, because of that. And there are moments where it falters more. On some of the covers, it doesn't really land as well as the covers do on Please Please Me. Please Please Me had better cover versions than With the Beatles. With the Beatles, you've got kind of clunky bits like Devil in Her Heart, which just doesn't sound correct most of the time. You've got... a lot of there's a big Motown influence on this album. There's very much an R&B influence. There's Smokey Robinson and Marvin Gaye influence was pretty prevalent, as well as their professed to girl group influence. So you've got, Motown-esque tracks like All I've Got to Do, or straight up Smokey Robinson covers like You Really Got a Hold on Me, or, the Barrett Strong track, The Closer of Money. It's on the whole... If the originals were the weaker bit of Please Please Me, then I think the covers are the weaker bit of With the Beatles. And that's actually where, we're not going to compare it too often, but the Americans actually got it a little bit better, because when this came out as Meet the Beatles, they attached I Want to Hold Your Hand onto the album, which is like the big track of these sessions. So I would say probably... and maybe it's unfair because it was also, in a sense, the album that launched Beatlemania in America and kind of got things going for them stateside, but in a different form and with different tracks. And in that sense, I would have to say probably this... It's a compliment to Please Please Me, and so because of that, I think it probably belongs in the C tier, It's right up there with Please Please Me. It's on equal footing, all things considered. So, moving along next, we have their first real great classic original masterpiece, the soundtrack to their first movie, A Hard Day's Night. This is significant in that it's the first Beatles album ever to be nothing but original compositions. John Lennon and Paul McCartney, they were tasked with, you've got to write songs for the movie. We're making the Beatles movie, it's got to have Beatles songs, so write us a bunch of Beatles songs. And they deliver in spades. The title track is classic, Can't Buy Me Love was a hit, If I Fell is great, and I Love Her is beautiful. And then even on the B-side with the album cuts, you've got the sort of like foreboding folk of Things We Said Today and I'll Be Back. You've got I'll Cry Instead, which is a gem. You've got the real good guitar riff of You Can't Do That. There's some clunkers as well. The song they give to George, I'm Happy Just to Dance With You, is not one of their best offerings. I Should Have Known Better it's a favorite to some. It's never had much of an imprint for me. Tell Me Why is clunky. When I Get Home is really clunky. They didn't give anything to Ringo at all. But at the same time, I think this is the album that sort of sums up Beatlemania at its peak. Not at its biggest, but at its peak moments of the Beatles enjoying it and the fans enjoying it in turn, and that kind of serendipitous circle of appreciation that everyone had for each other at the time. I think this is like the culmination of early Beatles records. So this probably is a B. Let's put it in the B tier. You know, it's not like a huge humongo one, but it's pretty solid. I think B is pretty solid for Hard Day's Night. So that's that one. Moving right along, second album of 1964, the very cynically titled Beatles for Sale. And you know, we've got the very dour looking faces on the cover. They already are kind of looking pretty tired. Great artwork on this album. I mean, the artwork is pretty spectacular. It's the first album of theirs to have a gatefold. So you've got this shot here of them at the Washington Coliseum, and you've got this little collage of them in front of a bunch of movie stars, which kind of foretells the imagery of Sgt. Pepper to some degree. So, I mean, like, packaging-wise, this is a gorgeous album. But, you know, musically, they sound tired. This is the first Beatles album where they sound like they're worn out. Their Dylan influence is pretty strong. A lot with John's like stuff is very much. It's the beginning of his sort of self-deprecating years, where he really puts himself down in a lot of his songs, and you've got things like No Reply, I'm a Loser, The Mournful Babies in Black, Every Little Thing from Paul, I Don't Want to Spoil the Party. So I mean, there's gems to be found here, even when they sound tired. George is given a Carl Perkins cut to sing. Ringo is given another Carl Perkins song to sing. The big hit is 8 Days a Week, which I don't think is one of their strongest hits. I think I Feel Fine was probably the better cut in that respect, and I think that John's been quoted as saying similar things. Mr. Moonlight is pretty clunky as a cover. Rock and Roll Music works to some degree, but it's not as strong as the Chuck Berry original. Kansas City is fine. Paul gives it his all on the vocals. But, I mean, it's one of those things where it's kind of a going back to the formula of the first two albums, but unlike with Please Please Me and with the Beatles, they don't sound as jazzed to be there. You know, I mean, even the title itself is pretty cynical. I mean, Beatles for Sale is like, you know, saying it all to some degree. It's like they're all, now already they're like, we're just pieces of meat. We threw this one together to make a quick buck. And mind you, that's not at all what this album is. I mean, even the Beatles at their tired sounds better than like a lot of the other groups that were out at the time. But it's kind of, this probably, I would say it's probably D tier. It's probably D tier because it's got the same mixed bag quality as albums 1 and 2, but the performances on the whole just are more worn and tired. So it's likely in the D tier. Let's put it there. So next we reach album 5. This is one where I disagree with a lot of people on it. This is Help. It's the second soundtrack to the second movie. It's very sparse artistically. You've got the film songs like Help, which is fine. You've got A Hide Your Love Away is pretty good. George starts really getting back into songwriting and delivers a fine one with I Need You. Paul's Another Girl is not one of his best, and neither is The Night Before. Ticket to Ride is a pretty strong single, but not one of their best. Catchy, but not one of their best. Ringo's cover of Act Naturally on side 2, I mean, it's fitting. And Ringo's pretty much the star of Help, so I mean, it kind of worked for they're going to put me in the movies, you know, for this album. I mean, it suited him well. You Like Me Too Much is one of George's worst songs. It feels like the work of an amateur songwriter that got that song released because he was a Beatle. Honestly, the same can be said about Tell Me What You See, even though it's, I think, a Paul composition, but it's not one of his best. But he makes up for it really quickly with I've Just Seen a Face, which I think it worked better on Rubber Soul in America. It's Only Love is another goodie, though I also think it worked better on Rubber Soul. And that one's from John. And then you have Yesterday, which became like the biggest song ever written by anyone. And then they end it on Dizzy Miss Lizzy, which is like just ham-fisted. It's the only cover, and it's the one that kind of had the least amount of passion put into it. I think if they'd put on I'm Down, which was the B-side of the single from Help, then it would have probably made for a stronger ending. Especially because, well, they both did. Like, Dizzy Miss Lizzy and I'm Down were both played by the Beatles live. But I'm Down had the, like, sort of the organ thing going, and it was an original, too. It was an original thing, and it just did it better than Dizzy Miss Lizzy. So it's one of those things where Help is really widely regarded. People put it on the same level as Hard Day's Night because of the highlights, which are very, very high. You know, Help is a big hit. Ticket to Ride is a big hit. Yesterday is like their first major standard. And you've got cuts like you've got The Height of Your Love Away and I Need You and You Like Me. No, and not that one. And It's Only Love and I've Just Seen a Face. So, I mean, I get why people like this record, or put it highly. To me, it's like still a mixed bag, though, because it's got its low moments, and it's also, they sound in a lot of the material just as tired as they did on Beatles for Sale. So it's one of those scenarios where it probably belongs in the B tier, but I can't justifiably put it there because I don't think that the material is performed very strongly. I think if they'd maybe had another pass at it, or they had more time to kind of refine the material down, then they probably would have had a stronger record. But for what they have here as their fifth album, I don't think it's as steady and is. It's not as steady a listen as Hard Day's Night. I think there are tracks which got put onto other records in America, and they sounded better on those records. So I'm gonna have to put it in C tier. It's better than Beatles for Sale, but it's also not as good as Hard Day's Night. So that's C tier. Okay, and now we're getting into the good stuff. Now this is when they become the band that everyone respects. Rubber Soul. Rubber Soul. This is like, in America, they lopped off a bunch of tracks and put on 2 acoustic ones from Help, and it made it their answer to folk rock, which I think even in its English incarnation, it still kind of is. I mean, just everything's a highlight here. There's not a single bad song on this album. I mean, Drive My Car is soulful classic. You Won't See Me is a great deep cut. The Word is okay, I mean, but it's still really, really good. Maybe Wait is the only weak one, or Run For Your Life. So, I mean, it's not spotless, but I mean, the highs are just so high. You've got Think For Yourself, which is just like a really garagey track, and If I Needed Someone. Both of them are Harrison compositions. If I Needed Someone is a sort of co-opt of the Byrds. And it all works, you know. And then just the acoustic stuff from Lennon. I mean, Norwegian Wood with the sitar became like, you know, hugely influential. Nowhere Man with its sort of like dense harmonies became hugely influential. The Baroque in My Life kind of began Lennon's autobiographical thing, which he would carry over to his solo career with great success. Michelle from Paul is a standard love song, but it's one of his, you know, classier compositions. What Goes On, even from Ringo, is like a fine effort. You know, it's It's pretty solid, I would say. This is the beginning of the Beatles being the band that everyone goes like, these are the records you have to listen to. I don't know if it qualifies as S tier because it's still very much, it has its less impressive moments still, that I don't know if I can fully give it S tier rank, but it's solidly an A. I would say it's definitely a solid A entry, and we will rank it as such. Now, Revolver, on the other hand, Revolver is a different story. This is, I already know what rank I'm giving this, but let's just talk about Revolver for a moment here. I mean, it's debatably their best album. It's debatably their most influential album. It's debatably them at their most collaborative and creative and influential. I mean, it really is like just everyone working at peak condition. You've got John delivering the great acid, like loud electric acid rock of I'm Only Sleeping, and She Said, and Your Bird Can Sing, Tomorrow Never Knows. I mean, he just, like, all four of those are killer stuff, and, like, high moments of the psychedelic rock movement. You've got Paul really working in the Baroque elements. He pretty much put a classical string octet on the pop radio with Eleanor Rigby. You know, which is like for like even today, people aren't brave enough to try to do that. Here, There, and Everywhere is gorgeous, and it's looping melodies. It's looping harmonies. I mean, Good Day Sunshine is just pure optimism. For No One is pure heartbreak, and Got to Get You Into My Life is just pure soul, man. I mean, it's. And then even George finally gets his big moments as a songwriter. He gets 3 songs, which is more than he got on any other single Beatles album. And like if he's not equal with Lennon McCartney yet, he's certainly getting there. I mean, Taxman is a killer opening cut. Love You Too is probably his best fusion of Indian music with rock music, and I want to tell you, it's not on the same level as those 2 songs, but it's still very, very strong. And I mean, we'll touch upon this later, but I think when people talk about how the Beatles defined what the album is supposed to be and defined how people are supposed to approach their music and how they're supposed to try to be inventive and be creative, I think the record that everyone looks to as a template is Revolver. I really do. I think that this is the record that everyone looks at and goes, this is what, you know, pop music at its best is. And I think it easily qualifies for S tier. No doubt in my mind. That's an S tier record, no question. And now, delivered upon to us after that is the next influential behemoth, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. I mean, what can I say about Pepper that hasn't been said by everyone under the sun? What can I say? From the deluxe packaging, from the inclusion of the lyrics on the back cover, which was like pretty much the publishing companies hated that because it like brought them out of business, to its, you know, very much its approach to trying to deliver pop music as art, to really stating that the album format was to be respected as a format in its own right. I mean, just this one piece of plastic delivered upon to the world a whole cultural revolution. So what can I say about this album that hasn't been said by everyone? I think it's overrated. I do. I think it's crazy overrated. I think that it's pretty much a Paul McCartney solo record in all respects. He's clearly the one leading the band by this point. And he far outranks the amount of stuff that John has. You know, like Paul gets the title track, he gets Getting Better, Fixing a Hole, She's Leaving Home. I mean, he gets 3 songs all in a row. That's already excessive. He gets When I'm 64 and Lovely Rita. So that's 6 out of the 13 tracks. So he gets practically half the album. You know, half the album is completely Paul McCartney. And beyond that, you have John Lennon giving it his all on Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds and A Day in a Life. I mean, John Lennon, A Day in a Life is a collab between him and Paul, but it's definitely John laying the groundwork for most of it. Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite is nice and pleasant. Good Morning is, even by John Lennon's admission, not one of his better efforts. I actually feel kind of sad for John because his best offering of the whole sessions was Strawberry Fields, and it didn't make it onto the album because it was a single. So, and for as much as George Martin would go in later years, like, oh, we should have put Strawberry Fields and Penny Lane on Sgt. Pepper, I don't think they really fit on Pepper. George's Within You and Without You is a drone to listen to. It's got heavy philosophical themes, and it continues on where he left off with Love You Too. But I think Love You Too had the better edge to it. Within You and Without You is just him doing it again. And it is not particularly that interesting to me. Little Help from My Friends, the Joe Cocker version, I think, outstrips the Beatles version, and that's one of the very rare times where I can say that about any Beatles cover. It's got good lyrics to it. It's got definitely that Lennon insecurity in the lyrics, but it's not one of their finest performances. So, I mean, it's one of those things where I recognize what it did for the industry, and I recognize what it did for music, and I recognize what it did for the Beatles in general. That said, I think in the long run, people took more influence from the records which preceded it and followed upon it afterwards. Very few people actually tried to do something like a Pepper ever again. And I think that was almost for the best. You know, it's a very excessive album, you know, and it's ironic that I'm saying this because this is the album that got me into the Beatles when I was like 3. But I listened to it again and again and again, and I just feel like there are other Beatles albums where they're collaborating together in a more cooperative way, and the filler is not as pronounced. Because there's filler on Pepper. There's filler on, like, Revolver as well. But the difference I've said is that with Pepper, here's the difference. For me, Revolver is the album where they added effects to the songs. And Pepper is the album where they made songs out of the effects. And I think that that's a very, very different philosophy, and it yields very, very different results. And I think the former is a more successful model of innovation than the latter, myself. So, all that said, do I put it in S tier because of its influence, or do I put it where I think it belongs in the... If I'm going off of personal opinion, and this is a controversial statement, if I'm going off of complete personal opinion, I would probably put it in the B tier. Because I think even Rubber Soul is a stronger song for song album than Sgt. Pepper. But at the same time, it was really influential, and it's so highly praised that I'm going to split the difference between the regular expectations and the regular sentiment and my own personal opinions and put it in the A category. It's right there in the middle where it kind of fits in with all things. It's not, I don't think it's as strong as Revolver, but I also think it's stronger at least than Hard Day's Night. So on, whole for whole, that's a pretty fair basis, I would say. Alright, so moving along from there, we got a little bit of an interesting addition to the proceedings. We have Magical Mystery Tour. Not an official Beatles album, or at least when it was released. This is the only time where the Beatles ever decided that America outdid what they had done on their own record. In England, this was released as a double EP with just the 6, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, just the 6 songs from their movie, which is one heck of a movie. But it was only released there in England as the movie songs. And in America, Capitol Records decided to also include the singles of Hello, Goodbye, Strawberry Fields, Penny Lane, and All You Need Is Love and Baby You're a Rich Man. And I think that made it a really strong compliment to Pepper. Now, I don't think that Strawberry Fields or Penny Lane really fit in with the mood of Magical Mystery Tour. I think they fit in more with the mood of Pepper. But that being said, to have essentially the singles of 1967, it's pretty much this album is like all the non-album tracks of 1967 that they put out that year. Like everything that didn't make it onto Pepper that year got put on the Magical Mystery Tour. And it made it maybe a confusing listen, but then the movie is a confusing watch, so that doesn't that's not moving out of the realm of anything that they were already doing. And I mean, it's one of those things where it's maybe in a sense even stronger than Pepper for all I know. It could even be stronger than Pepper, and but I think it's very nice to be able to have as many good songs on one album as this has, and this has very spectacular songs, particularly on side 2, which almost blew side 1 out of the water, if not actually does. That said, it's an artistic hash of their it's a hash of their artistic intention, and I'm glad that like in later years they were able to accept that maybe sometimes the record label like had outdone them. But all that being said, I think it made sense that because it's not really an official Beatles album that they designed themselves, but rather a just stunning collection of singles and things, by the strength of the singles, it's B tier, and it would maybe, if it was my own personal preference, maybe I would put it higher than Pepper, but I also think that just as a whole, it's a stellar listen. It's where they get spacey. It's their spacey album. And the only thing that really holds it back from true greatness is that it was not what the Beatles ever intended to be a record. We're going to skip ahead a little bit here and continue on with the kind of recording chronology and go instead into the next soundtrack album of Yellow Submarine. Now, I don't think this is anyone's favorite Beatles album. I think I can safely say that this is no one's favorite Beatles album. It was not, I don't even think it's the Beatles' favorite Beatles album. I think it's very much in the vein of the American version of Hard Day's Night and of Help, which is that it's a soundtrack album first and the Beatles album second. And what is here from the Beatles is not even their best work of the period. 2 of the tracks, Yellow Submarine and All You Need Is Love, had already been released anyway. Yellow Submarine had already been put out on Revolver, so that made it a song that appeared twice on 2 different albums. And All You Need Is Love was on Magical Mystery Tour. So technically not official Beatles album, but, even by 68 or 69, people were already getting Magical Mystery Tour on import. So, in that sense, they filled up their, 2 of the 6 songs they deliver were already released. And then what is the new material is all outtakes from Pepper and Mystery Tour. So you've got Only a Northern Song, which is George's reject from Pepper, and in my opinion, maybe it was a bit stronger than Within You and Without You, but it still was just a reject. All Together Now and It's All Too Much were rejects from Magical Mystery Tour. I think All Together Now should have probably stayed in the bin. It's All Too Much is, a bit worthy up there. It's definitely the Beatles at their most, Hendrix, I guess would be the word, though they're not as soulful as Hendrix on that cut, but it's definitely like them guitars ablaze, fire going. And then the best cut of the new stuff is Hey Bulldog, and it's mainly because it was the only track that was actually written and recorded for the movie, and it actually points toward where they're going to go in their future, because it's like a return to the roots rock stuff. It was recorded around the same time as Lady Madonna. So, that's the Beatles stuff. But then all of side 2 is George Martin's orchestral score. So you've got one half of an album that is actually what people would want to hear on a Beatles album. And then you've got the other half of the album, which is all classical music and incidental themes from the movie. Here's all I can say about it, honestly. The back cover, which if this ends up in focus, the back cover is just... it's a copy of the same image on the front cover, but all these liner notes here, and I said this in the SpongeBob episode, all these liner notes here are a review of the White Album, because this got released while the White Album was still, hot selling. So they cared so little about this album that they actually advertised their last album on the back cover. So, yeah, it's pretty weak. Pretty weak all around. I would have to put it in the F category. It's their weakest record. It is their weakest record by far, and just very much a disappointment. But that's countered very quickly, at least in recording wise, by the Beatles, otherwise known as the White Album, which is actually my favorite Beatles album. Now, my copy here is a little bit dinged up, my little vinyl copy here. Now, I have multiple vinyl copies of the White Album, because of course I do. This one was special for me because it had... The outer sleeve is the mono repressing from 2014, I want to say, which I wanted to get because it was as close to redoing the original packaging as possible. The stereo vinyl that you find has the embossed cover, but not the printed serial number at the bottom, which is what I was looking for. So, and I bought it in Las Vegas, actually, when I was there for Thanksgiving of 2018, which you can see, actually. I recorded in the Mario Bros. Remaster video. You can see me in the Mirage Hotel in Vegas, and the Vegas hotel skyline behind me. So that's that. And I bought this at the official Beatles store because obviously I went to Vegas to see the Love show, which was spectacular. But the Mirage or whoever it was packaged this really poorly because it needed to. I didn't want to carry it on the plane because I thought that was just asking for trouble if I had it to try to stow it in the glove compartment or whatever on the plane, and it was the journey from Vegas back to Pittsburgh or wherever. It was a long journey, and I just knew that if I was carrying it around for me the whole time, it was going to get damaged somehow. So we ended up having them mail it out, and they mailed it out poorly, and the spine is bent in because of it. But anyway, that's just me talking about my vinyl. What do I think of the White Album? Well, as I've already said, it's my favorite Beatles album. It's their return to form as musicians. maybe it's lacking in artistic inspiration, which I don't think it is at all. But as far as cohesion goes, I mean, the classic thing about the White Album is that it's a mess to listen to. It's a double album. It's their only double album aside from compilations. And it's the start of the Beatles being a songwriters entity, which is to say they aren't really a band anymore. It is John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr all in a group together, and they are playing on each other's songs, but it is definitely four individuals writing four different styles of song. So Paul's more whimsical pop, John's more bluesy hard rock, George's guitar, soul, fusion, and Ringo's is country and western. I think in that sense it's very foretelling because more so than any other Beatles album, it points the way toward where they're going to go in the future. But I also think that it has their greatest... as songwriters and as musicians, it's their grandest work of material, you know. I mean, just back in the USSR, Dear Prudence, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, Happiness is a Warm Gun, Blackbird, I'm So Tired, Piggies, More From My Dear, Don't Pass Me By, Why Don't We Do It on the Road, I Will, Julia, Birthday, Your Blues, Everybody's Got Something to Hide Except Me and My Monkey, Mother Nature's Son, Sexy Sadie, Helter Skelter, Savoy Truffle, and like the acoustic version of Revolution. I mean, there's just so much here that's good. And maybe to some people it needs editing. I mean, there are a lot of filler things here as well, but the filler that's here is by and large the most interesting filler that the Beatles ever put on their albums. And its chaotic nature kind of perfectly reflected the chaotic nature of 1968 anyway. Certainly reflected the chaotic nature of the tensions within the band at the time. It's my favorite one. It's my favorite album of theirs. But even that said, does it then mark peak Beatles? Now, that's a question. That's the question. Because does it rank as peak Beatles? Because if it does, what it's battling for right now is it worthy of being put in the S tier? Is it worthy of being put there? And if I was talking completely subjectively, I would say yes, I would put it in the S tier straight away. But it's pretty messy. It's pretty messy. There's a lot of filler, and you know, there's even people who've said that maybe they would want it to be edited down to just a single album. And it's very divisive, too. I mean, there are tracks on this album that people actively do not like. You know, Oobla Dee Oobla Da is a big hit, and there are people who actively don't like it. Revolution Number 9 is a 8-minute sound collage that people actively do not like. So, is it worthy of S tier? And I would have to say probably no. I think it might actually, even if it's my favorite album of theirs, and it is, I think the White Album has to be put in the A tier because it is so unwieldy messy and has moments of faltering within it that it doesn't rank up there as the Beatles at their absolute best. So there you go. That's a statement I would have never expected to say. Alright, and then we're going to skip ahead once more to Let It Be, because we're doing this chronologically with recording. So Let It Be is their final album, in quotes, because it's not really their final album. It was supposed to be an album called Get Back, which would have been their return to their roots, which is silly because they already had kind of returned to their roots on the White Album a little bit. This is always viewed of as one of their more controversial records because Phil Spector came in and fiddled around with it afterwards. He put a lot of heavy strings on it, slowed some songs down, put his wall of sound all around it. You've got, but also you've got classics like Get Back, Let It Be, Across the Universe, I'm Mine from George, but it's also the Beatles at their most salty and their most divisive and incisive. At their most warring with themselves, at least. That's what it is, more so than anything else. It's definitely they're definitely in a bad mood recording most of this, and you kind of hear it on the record. Even the happy moments have a tinge of sadness in them. So, does it land? I think that I'm not a part of the camp of people who say that Glyn Johns' original mix of Let It Be would have saved the record, because he underproduced Get Back. I do believe Phil Spector overproduced Let It Be, and I do like the songs here. I mean, I legitimately like the material on this album. I grew up with this as a close one to my heart, but I also recognize that its creation and its deliverance was really controversial. And it's one of those records that has a pretty mixed reaction amongst Beatles fans. So, where does that put it in the tier list? I would say probably B. It's probably B tier for Beatles records. Because it's one of those albums where it's not bad by any stretch of the imagination. At least I don't believe it's bad by any stretch of the imagination. But its divisive nature, it doesn't yield as many rewards as the White Album, and it's pretty chaotic to listen to. It's a messy record, but that's how it is sometimes. Which closes us off now on the grand finale, Abbey Road. Now, Abbey Road is, in according to some corners of the internet, their best album. To some people, this is their greatest masterwork. And I think it's okay. Subjectively, this is A tier for me. But and that's mainly because the thing for me is that I think that Abbey Road, it's a great album. And it's the Beatles at their highest level of musicianship. Particularly Ringo and George, the two underserved musicians of the band. Like, George by now had developed into a phenomenal sled guitar player. And Ringo's drumming on this album is the best drumming I think he ever did in his whole career. It's so good. So, I mean, you have them at their best level of musicianship combined with George Martin at his, pretty much at his production best. I think Abbey Road, to me, is a masterpiece of production. I think the problem I have of it is also part of what I like about it. Which is to say, I think it's only half an album in some respect. You've got the whole of side one, which is like songs. Is like the side one of Abbey Road is like the rock side. That's come together in something which is like their grand finale of a final single. Even though Let It Be is the grand finale of a final single. You've got Oh Darling, the proto-metal of I Want You, She's So Heavy, Ringo's Yellow Submarine rewrite of Octopus's Garden, and Paul's Maxwell Silver Hammer. See, this is what I mean. Is that it even on the strong side one, it still falters. And then from there, we get side two, which is the McCartney kind of pop side, which is Here Comes the Sun, which is beautiful, and Because, which is beautiful. And then from that point on, it becomes the medley. And the medley is well respected, and I like the medley fine. But it doesn't do what, say, in my mind, grand 17-minute long statements like the ending of Abbey Road, right, need to kind of have a narrative through line to them. And I don't think that Abbey Road's medley has that. It tries, and it, for the most part, succeeds, because Paul's stuff has a continuum through it. To go from You Never Give Me Your Money to Golden Slumbers to Carry That Way to the end. That is like, here's a continuum, and it's about the end of the Beatles, and that's what this is about. And if it was just those 4 songs, if Paul dominated on this, I'd be fine, and I'd think that was great. But in order to make it the Beatles, John had to contribute some things as well, and his stuff hasn't practically nothing to do with Paul's material. It's very underdeveloped on his end, and it's one of those things where sometimes you would wish that those songs had been fleshed out into something more, because I really, really like Mean Mr. Mustard and Polythene Pam, and I wish that they had been fleshed out into songs which are more than just the, minute and a half that they get. You know, they get 2 verses each, and then it's on to the next thing. So, in that sense, I feel like almost Abbey Road kind of sells itself short in some sense because it is half of an album. But that's my own subjective opinions. Putting all that aside, I think it's the best album that they could have done to go out on. I think it's pretty obviously the great grand finale. And if you're going to be ending a discography as well fabled as the Beatles, it's clearly this was the record to end on. Or was it? On the VOD, go look at my fake Beatle album videos, which I need to make a part 4 on, and I will in a couple of weeks. But I think that probably because of how well the production is, and also it's their highest level of musicianship, and it's their grand finale, and it's one of their most beloved albums, it's not my view, but I do think it probably has earned its S tier ranking. So that is it. That is the Beatles albums ranked. This is the tier list. We've got Revolver and Abbey Road in the S tier, Rubber Soul, Sgt. Pepper and the White Album in the A tier, Hard Day's Night, Magical Mystery Tour, and Let It Be in the B tier, Please Please Me with the Beatles and Help in the C tier, Beatles for Sale in the D tier, and Yellow Submarine failing all along the way in its F tier. I think that's fair. I think that that's very much a fair assessment of their discography. It's very evenly paced in that sense, you know. According to most people, probably everything would be S, but I don't think that that's really accurate to. And bear in mind too that even the C, D, and F. Well, maybe not so Yellow Submarine, but the C and D records, bear in mind that even those are better than most other people's, best albums, you know? A lot of people will make their best album and it still doesn't even come close to the Beatles at their most mediocre. So, I mean, it's very much like looking at a whole art gallery of masterpieces and then ranking the masterpieces. But I think that this is pretty much a fair, sort of spreading of praise. So I would say that's a fair ranking. And thank you for coming along with me on this journey into seeing how well the Beatles albums stack up. Maybe I'll do another one of these at some point. I don't know. But for all I know, right now, this is the ranking. So thank you very much. And now we're moving on.